Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that Rishi Sunak may consider a one-off payment to nurses to end the strike. Well, making that public means he's now going to have to. I don't know whether it will end the strikes, with this offer, but unless there's a genuine attempt to come to a serious arrangement with this year's pay award, it will not deal with the problem itself. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the news last night, basically in today's newspapers, is that Sunak may be prepared to help with the cost of living via a one-off payment for nurses to end the dispute. Now, the article I was reading talked about the possibility of a hardship payment. Now, assuming that this is not the author of the article playing fast and loose with terminology here, and I don't think it is, that raises a number of issues for me. The first is it would be an acknowledgement that nurses face hardship due to their pay. Well, if they face hardship this year, they're going to face greater hardship next year. Because the fact that inflation will drop this year doesn't mean the cost of living eases. It means the cost of living gets worse. Just by the costs rise by a lower amount, but they still rise. So the cost of living this year will be what it was last year, plus a load extra. But if you never received an increase in pay to manage with last year's extra costs of living, you're doubly screwed this year. So there should be a permanent increase in the pay to lift nurses out of this hardship. The second point is that even awarding a one-off payment to lift nurses out of hardship, if that's what they do, shows that the government can find the money when it needs to. This is assuming it doesn't just take it out of existing budgets and then blame nurses for the further loss of public services. The Tories are buggers for announcing new funding that turns out not to be new funding at all, just moving the money around. The third point is that if the government have to acknowledge that a significant number of NHS nurses face hardship due to their low pay, they are acknowledging that many other public sector workers also face hardship. Many of RMT's rail workers, for example, they won't be on wages above that of a nurse, and a great many of them will be below that. I don't think we even need the media to amplify these points. These are straightforward enough that they will surely occur to a great many members of the voting public. It's why the government wanted to hold fast on all the strike action. They knew that if one union successfully made its case and came away with a better award, even if just a one-off, then it would weaken the government's argument in most of the other cases as well. But the government has been losing the PR battle with nurses, even their own voters, which are the only members of the public who can influence this battle. Doesn't matter what overall public opinion says about the strike action, it's irrelevant. What do Tory voters say? And for Tory voters, they're evenly split on their support for nurses. And as I've said before, that would suggest to me a significant number of target swing voters would be on the nurses' side. And Tory polling will be telling them exactly what their important voters think about each individual strike. I have to speculate a little bit. The Tories don't. They can target their polls exactly as they need to. But that Tory MPs are backing Sunak to ignore the case of unions representing rail workers, firefighters, postal workers, border force, university staff, civil servants and so on. That will be because their polls are telling them that their voters are with the government, but the story is different for nurses. This is why a number of Tory MPs, including some big names, have called on Sunak to do something other than sit on his hands, which is a strategy they approve of in all other cases. But it's hypocritical. If a nurse cannot manage the cost of living on a particular wage, a rail or postal worker can't manage on an even lower wage, can they? Another thing to consider is that although the strikes are officially about pay in most cases, certainly for existing nurses, there is a wider campaign to draw attention to the link between poor pay and nurse shortages. Paying nurses a fair wage is not just for the individuals, but to save the service itself. The NHS can't cope with these shortages, and the shortages will not get better until the profession is an attractive prospect for people. We've made it harder to recruit with our post-Brexit immigration policy, which makes it actually very easy for foreign workers all over the world to come to the UK to work for a well-paid job, but incredibly difficult to do so for low-paid jobs like nursing. And it's the government that defined nursing as low-paid, by the way, in their own immigration policy. So they've basically got an immigration policy that pushes British workers into the lower-paid jobs. So we basically need lots of British people to take up these nursing jobs to fill the shortage. But the conditions make it even worse. You know, due to staff shortages, it means that the fewer nurses that are there have a much greater workload. It's more stressful. It's not exactly desirable. In order to entice people into the profession, you need to pay them properly. And it's no good conning teenagers with slick advertising campaigns. Oh, nurse is brilliant. And they go, oh, brilliant. And they go and train. And then they work as a couple of years for a nurse and then leave the profession. That does no good. Well, there's a similar thing going on with teaching as well. Labour are reported to be preparing a vote in Parliament this week, as it returns, to impose VAT on private school fees in order to provide more funding for state teachers. Obviously, the Tories will sink it. But they point out that about 30% of all teachers who have qualified since the Tories came to power have already left the profession. So that's new teachers. That doesn't include those who've taught for decades and then just naturally retired. It may, I suppose, include some who started teaching very late in life and then retired, but most of those will be people who've gone into the profession and gone, no, thank you. And with teachers also balloting for strike action at the moment over pay, just as with nurses, they are pointing to the shortages, overwork and stress factors that are leading to teachers leaving the profession, not just pay. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, the workload for teachers went up massively during the Conservatives' time in office. You know, when I was teaching under Labour, you had about 21 hours of contact teaching. When I stopped a year or two ago, it was about 25. Now, I know non-teachers they'll understand, but they'll not really appreciate the amount of time that goes into planning, marking and so on for each of those contact hours. But what you had there was pretty much a 20% increase in workload, and it was already a fairly hefty workload, without considering the extra difficulties, particularly those that come with shortages and the lower real terms pay that the Tories imposed as well. But I may talk about more on that later this week if the debate in Parliament throws up some interesting points, we'll see. But as for the nurses, there is a scenario where Sunak makes this one-off payment and it works. Sunak's consistently said he will not tell pay review boards to go back to the drawing board for last year's awards, but there is scope for discussion in next year's pay settlement. So in theory, you could say, okay, in theory, he could award this lump sum for now, then make sure the pay review board are given recommendations which takes account of the dramatic fall in real terms pay in recent years. When I say recent years, I mean since the Tories came to power. That would be fine. The problem is that the government have already been briefing that they expect to offer nurses 2% later this year, which would be another real terms pay cut of several percent, at least 3.5% according to Rishi Sunak. And this is before their pay review boards have even done their work. All they would then need to do is create, they'd just be creating the conditions for another strike next autumn or winter. It's possible that Sunak just wants to deal with the issue now, do whatever's needed to sort it out in the short term, just like Johnson before him, not really worry about solutions creating a headache later on, because that's later on, he might not even be around. I've said before, Sunak's clearly using the strikes in order to fight a duel to the death with unions. He wants a Thatcher-esque victory to get his MPs on side. You could argue a one-off payment to nurses doesn't weaken that position because many of his MPs are in support of it, and then it allows him to focus, I suppose, on fighting the unions for which he does have the support of his voters. But it will weaken his hand in public against demands from other poorly paid workers at least. As for the deal itself, I mean, we'll know more once the government have held their meetings, I suppose. But it sounds like the offer is for a one-off payment. We'll assume it's reasonable, I don't know. Followed by a bigger pay rise this year if they accept what the Health Secretary has said are efficiency savings. Now, a real efficiency savings doesn't really need negotiation with workers because that's all it is. It's doing the same thing with less money. It's never a matter for workers, for budget holders to be more efficient with their budgets. What they mean is more money for nurses if they take on even more strenuous workloads or agree to work in less safe conditions. That's what they mean. That's what they always mean. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.